Welcome, students. I'm Donna Attanasio. I lead the energy program at George Washington University Law School. I'd like to welcome you all here today, and I'm really delighted to also welcome our guests, Todd Mullins and Allison Wood. They're both partners at McGuire Woods, and they are also GW alumni. Before I go to the full introductions, I'd also like to remind everyone that this is the first of a series of introductions. A series of interviews that we'll be having regarding careers in energy and environmental law. I was going to urge you to check back frequently to the page on which you registered, but we're having some problems with that page as of this morning. So we'll hopefully get those rectified, and we'll let you know how to get in line for upcoming seminars. But we do have 4 more scheduled, several more in the works. So I do hope you'll be joining us for those as well. If you have questions during today's session, please put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as possible. Because this is being recorded, I will wrap this up at 12:30 promptly. If we aren't able to, I'll also try to have our guests hang around for a few minutes longer if there's a few more questions to answer. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Todd Mullins and Allison Wood. They're both partners in the law firm of McGuire Woods in its Washington, D.C. office. Todd is the managing partner of the Washington office, and he serves as the chair of the Energy Enforcement Practice Group. He represents clients before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and courts. Allison leads the firm's ESG's task force, and is nationally recognized as a leader in the field of environmental law, particularly in the area of climate change. She's guided through clients through complex and politically charged precedent-setting cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and several courts of appeal. So with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Todd and Allison. And if you want more biographical information, you'll be able to find it on the McGuire Woods website. So let's get started. I'd like to start first with you, Todd. Can you tell us a little bit about what type of energy practice you have at McGuire Woods, and just a little bit of background about where this started before the environmental practice joined?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for allowing me to participate today. So it's interesting. Energy practice can mean different things to different people, but so I want to talk about it at a couple of levels. Our firm, we're about 1,000 lawyer firm, and we have about 100 plus attorneys in our firm who either practice law in a very energy specific way or are practicing law for clients who are energy focused clients and where knowledge of the energy industry is important to their discipline. Taking it down to a smaller level, we have a federal energy regulatory practice here in the Washington, D.C. office, and some folks in some of our other offices, about 10 lawyers who more or less full time do that work, including, I counted up 3 GW alums, including the first year we just hired. Those folks do very sort of classic FERC regulatory and enforcement work. And deal work that involves regulatory approvals. We have a lot of people across a lot of our offices who do state energy regulatory work before state utility commissions. We have a lot of lawyers across our firm who do deal work that just involves the energy space. And so that knowledge is required. We represent a wide array of clients. It used to be that there were energy practices where you're only going to represent sort of one part, and that has really fallen away in energy law practices now. So we represent the gamut of sort of very large traditional utility holding companies that own utilities that you think about. We represent smaller development companies who are trying to enter into merchant competitive generation and transmission project spaces. We represent banks and hedge funds and private equity funds. And others, and sometimes individuals who are caught up in enforcement matters. And so, yeah, that's basically our practice.
So Allison's Allison came to you a couple of years ago, bringing her environmental practice over to McGuire Woods. And of course, firms think strategically before they bring someone in. There's goals that they have in bringing in a practice like Allison's. What did you see as being the advantages to having Allison's practice join McGuire Wood?
So because of the significant energy commitment that we have in the space we're occupying with energy clients, these clients all, with almost without any exception, have environmental law needs. And while we had an environmental law practice, we didn't have an environmental law practice in Washington that was heavily focused on the environmental and particularly the air regulatory aspects of environmental law practice. It was a gap, just had a gap. And we would have clients call us and say, do you have, this? Can you get me one of your partners? And we would be like, no, sorry, which law firms hate to say. And we want to provide, complete solutions. And also because there's an increasing convergence between the energy regulatory space and the environmental regulatory space and the business aspects of compliance in those spaces. And you've got regulators and this has been happening for a while, but it's really happening now. It's been happening for 10 or more years, but there's a real convergence where you've got regulators on the traditional energy side who are thinking lots about environment issues, and you've got environmental lawyers who are recognizing that the economic regulation of energy is critical to solutions for all of us and to the legal problems that you face. So we didn't have this group. We were courting Allison and some of her colleagues for quite some time, and they have finally agreed to join us about 2 years ago now. And so we have filled that gap, and we are very happy about that.
Well, thank you. Allison, I'd like to turn to you. Tell us a little bit about what your practice is, how it's evolved over the years, and sort of what you saw attractive about coming over to McGuire Wood.
Thanks, and thanks for having us. And one thing that hasn't gotten mentioned is that both Todd and I, he mentioned folks who work in the FERC practice, but he didn't mention himself, but both Todd and I are GW law alums. And are happy to be here today. My practice is environmental law, and really it focuses on the Clean Air Act and on climate. And when I was a young attorney and an associate doing Clean Air Act work, I could not see when I started out, where we are today and where my practice would be today. It started out with a very simple, petition for rulemaking under the Clean Air Act that asked EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, which was a very novel idea at the time and one that it wasn't clear whether you could do. Fast forward through, the DC Circuit and then all the way to the Supreme Court and the Massachusetts versus EPA decision that said, yes, you can regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, and in some instances you must. And here we are today. My clients, I help them all the way from pre-rulemaking stages, writing rulemaking comments, litigation over policy matters. It's a very DC-based practice in that it's very policy-oriented. It's pretty interesting how regulations get made. Most of my clients are electric generating companies, and I also represent quite a few in the oil and gas sector. So energy is the vast majority of what I'm doing. And as we have moved over the past 20 years toward where we are today, with climate change just really moving to the forefront of where energy clients are having to focus, you see more and more of the intersection between what Todd does and what I do, and my needing to be able to pull in folks like Todd or to help me understand when we're making legal arguments about the Federal Power Act and how that might be an impediment to something we want to do on the climate change front, being able to talk with folks like Todd and understand that. And so that was a big piece of making the move to McGuire Woods, and what was so attractive to me and then the rest of my colleagues who I move with, who are also Clean Air Act lawyers, was that the base of our client base melded well with their client base, and that we felt like our experience would enhance what they do and vice versa. And indeed, that has really been the case. And I think it will only continue to be the case as we continue to move toward, net zero goals and, keeping the lights on.
I'm going to interject here with a question that's come in from a student because I think it really fits nicely in here. I really appreciate that elaboration of what your practice looks like. We have a question from Kim Wood who is asking, she's heard that there's two main areas of environmental practices, regulatory and finance. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the specific projects your firm has done in either of these areas?
Well, I would say I'm much more firmly in the regulatory space, but I'm not just in the regulatory space. Like I said, I run the gamut from early thoughts on how to regulate through litigation over whether that regulation is or is not proper under the statute that it's being promulgated under. I have done very little myself in the finance piece of it, uh, other than sometimes reviewing something that a colleague might ask me to look at. So it's very tough for me to talk about that finance piece. But what I would say is regulatory, I wouldn't box myself into just that on the environmental side. I would help folks with compliance policy all the way through, complex litigation.
So I'm really interested in how the practice is sort of changing and growing. I know that certainly at the time when I was, well, academic institutions look at energy and environment as things that we teach together. And yet, when I was certainly in practice for many years, we had an environmental group and we had an energy group. And you're right, we kind of, sometimes we had clients that overlap, but we didn't really work so much together. And I'm wondering if you can talk, the two of you, talking a little bit about how do you see this growing? Do you see your practices converging? Do you see young attorneys maybe practicing a little bit on both the energy and environmental side? What kinds of developments are we seeing right now?
So I can start on that. I mean, I think we will just expect a continued convergence between, I think, at the federal level and to a degree at the state level, but especially at the federal level, a convergence in the regulation of both the energy industry and environmental problems. And you already are seeing for sure that, especially on the energy regulatory side, those regulators have very much, and part of this is due to the recent election, but part of it is not. You see an increasing focus on the part of those energy regulators on an environmental agenda. One of our fellow alums, who's one of the FERC commissioners now, is high on that list, and the current chair at FERC definitely has environmental policies in the forefront of his mind when he's thinking about energy regulation. So it's increasingly important for practitioners to have an orientation towards those issues, but also resources to call on inside their firms where they can go and say, okay, I'm not an environmental lawyer, but this is what's being talked about over here in my energy regulatory space. What is this about? How is this working? What's going on with the EPA on this kind of stuff? And so, that's important. I think, though, one thing to keep your mind on is that I don't think there's going to be a huge change in the forums in which these issues get played out. So you've got separate regulators. I don't think we're going to see a merger of the EPA and the FERC anytime soon. So they have their own fiefdoms, they have their own regulatory ways, and they have their own process and practice norms and requirements. And so for a young lawyer coming up, I don't know that you can do both from a practice standpoint, but I think you have to. And so, and in order to be effective for clients, you still have to go and practice in those procedural venues. And so that's not going to change. But what is going to be increasingly important is having the awareness and the subject matter expertise of colleagues, or perhaps your own subject matter knowledge about the environmental things as the policies start to merge between the agencies and within the courts.
Would you like to add to that, Allison?
Yeah, I think that Todd is absolutely right. And he mentioned the election. And I think you can't talk about this without talking some about the election. So the reason I say that is that when President Biden took office, one of the, his day one activities was an executive order on climate change that has mandated what he called a whole of government approach to the issue, meaning we're not going to just silo this in the EPA, that all federal agencies need to think about climate change and what they can do under the statutes that give them power to address this issue. And two really obvious agencies with power over this are FERC and the EPA. And so there you start to see the two coming together. And for me, I need to have at least a rudimentary understanding, and I mean rudimentary, of what it is that Todd does to be able to converse with my clients. And one really basic example of that is when we start talking about different ideas in the climate change realm and the environmental space, we need to make sure for our clients, they need those to be recoverable in rate scheme. So I have to keep that in the back of my mind, and I can then go to Todd and we can talk about rate recovery. And what rate recovery is, in case you don't know, it's where, say, an electric utility company spends a lot of money toward a climate solution. They want to be able to pass that cost onto their customers through their rates. And that's where FERC comes in and where Todd comes in. And so there's a real obvious intersection. And I think Todd is also right that it's not necessarily that Todd and I are going to become, our practices will become identical. They won't, but our practices are complementary. And that complementary nature is only becoming more necessary to be able to attract and to serve your clients in the way that they want to be served.
Yeah, and I was going to say a decent specific example of how this might end up working is if you've got the environmental regulators who are creating mandates for carbon emissions. A lot of the carbon emissions are happening in power plants generating electricity in these wholesale energy markets, which are from an economic standpoint regulated by the FERC. And many people for a long time have talked about, well, we need to put a price on carbon and we need to build that into the rates that are charged for wholesale energy sales that are regulated by FERC. And, so at some point, if that's the way this all goes, clients who are talking to Allison about the policies associated with carbon regulation, state or federal, are going to need to know, and what policy should I be advocating at the FERC, or what should I be getting ready for that they're going to do on their own that's going to put a price on my operations that might allow me to, if I'm greener, to make money from that greenness, or if I'm not as green, to manage my risk and manage the economics of being able to comply. Somebody's going to have to pay, and because we got to keep the lights on. So that
I think it's great that you brought up that example of add a carbon price to the wholesale price of electricity. So in other words, you factor in what is the cost of the carbon that's associated with that molecule of electricity, that electron. On my side of it, the way that you would come and it would suddenly implicate Todd, because he just gave the way on his side, I'm going to give the way from my side, would be, and EPA tried this under the Obama administration, would be, they say, we're going to force you to dispatch the least carbon emitting electricity first. So in other words, you need to dispatch your renewables followed by gas, with coal coming last because it has the highest CO2 associated with its combustion. When that was proposed, that's where I was suddenly thrown in with, Todd and people like Todd, because we had to understand, because the clients are squawking that dispatch is done economically, not not by the amount of greenhouse gases that are associated with the electricity. So there was tension between those two positions, and they're coming head to head. And we talk about this whole of government approach. Those are two ways to get at it, but they're competing ways, and in some ways maybe conflicting.
Yeah, and so then here's this other connection with all of this. If you're going to by mandate or through economic regulation, through putting a price on carbon, which incentivizes the use of the renewables, which are frequently intermittent, what we call intermittent resources. So if the sun doesn't shine, if the wind doesn't blow. So now what do you do to get the energy where it needs to go? You have to use the transmission system, which is also regulated by FERC. And you have to build new transmission if in some instances, or you have to price transmission service in certain ways that allows us to utilize those intermittent resources in a way that, again, keeps the lights on. So FERC has to regulate that stuff, and FERC can create incentives for those transmission systems economics or the building of them in order to hook up these renewables. Like we got tons of wind coming from the Midwest, or we've got offshore wind coming in certain places that's got those electrons got to go someplace. And FERC regulates the economics of all that stuff, and it's huge money, huge money. And our clients need to know, what's that all going to look like? How do I advocate for doing all this in a way that's going to be good for my business and navigate this stuff that's happening amongst a breadth of regulatory space that's new?
No, and the building of new transmission has really come to the fore in recent years because of the explosion in the building of much more renewable energy, much more wind, much more solar. Well, that has to get connected to the grid via transmission lines. And that then can bring up a whole host of other environmental issues. When you're building a transmission line, you're crossing lands. Are you crossing federal parkland? Because now you have issues. Are you crossing through a wetland that's going to require some fill? Well, that's an environmental issue. Are you going to pass through some part of a habitat that maybe an endangered species lives in? Now you have a really big issue. There's a whole host of environmental. It's not just go out and build a transmission line. It really, really hard to build a transmission line.
I'd like to throw in here, certainly as we look at how to educate our students, we are seeing crossovers not only between energy and environment, but also with health. And we think about how, as Todd alluded to earlier, our regulators each have their own little silo that they operate in. And so, trying to think about these things, and from the company perspective, I think that's really where it all comes together, because they have to be thinking about, am I going to have somebody coming after me about the health impacts? Am I going to have, what's my timeline given the environmental impacts? What is the rate recovery issue? They've got to cover all of these issues, and it's all got to come together. So, coming at it from the academic side, we try to think about, how do we educate students to get into this area to be able to practice? I do have one more student question I want to throw at you, but can we talk just for a minute or so about what students should be thinking about as they prepare? Todd's indicated you're probably going to practice in one area, but what else do they need to know? What else do they have to be able to, the old issue spotter problem, which is really what happens when a client comes in and says, I have a problem. You've got to spot their issues and figure out what problem do they have. What can we do for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the offerings of subject matter law classes that span these things, span these areas. And even if a student says, well, I want to be an environmental lawyer, and that's like their idea of their mission in life, they should take those classes that relate to energy regulation. Because when they get out into the world, for almost all environmental regulatory disciplines, the overlapping with the energy space is significant. And similarly, if somebody says, oh, I want to be a FERC lawyer, or I want to really be in the energy space, they should be taking the offerings in the environmental regulatory space when they have the chance in their later years after the mandatory curriculum. They should be taking those classes so they have a grounding, and so that when they're interviewing with people, and also being involved in the outside the classroom activities like Donna's program, where there are clinical opportunities or writing opportunities or studying opportunities, being able to have something on your resume that demonstrates an interest, even for a first year, for these niche areas where people are looking and sometimes do hire first years, a demonstrated interest on that resume through classwork and other things is definitely an edge up.
Yep, I would agree with that. You know, once you get past your mandatory classes, you know, taking, you know, at least the introductory environmental law and energy law courses is going to give you a huge leg up in terms of being able to understand a lot of these issues that we're talking about. And also, as Todd said, you know, if this is the area you want to go in, it shows more of a demonstrated interest, as can any internships that you look for and looking for, you know, and that'll make you stand out. It shows that you're not just saying to me that you want to be an environmental lawyer because you're sitting with an environmental lawyer, but that no, your actions actually show that, you know, that really is, you know, where your passions lie, and you've taken some demonstrated steps toward that.
It's also a great way to find out if they really are interested. Again, just thinking about this from the perspective of, you know, having counseled many students as well as having been in private practice for many years, it's not for everyone. But on the other hand, if you find it is, you know, I have people that come in like, wow, I never expected to like this. I love it. So having that trial is really important. So one of the questions we have from a student, can either speaker speak to the impact of Biden's infrastructure bills on the future of energy and environmental policy and litigation?
Well, I could speak to them if they passed, but and we've got a lot of people pay. We also have here at McGuire Woods what we call McGuire Woods Consulting, which is a legislative affairs lobbying shop, and they are focused on energy and environmental issues as well, and they're trying to follow the infrastructure bills. Some clients are trying to influence, you know, what's going into those bills, and then other clients are, to the extent there's anything that's actually passed, waiting for the agencies to actually figure out how they're going to dole things out. But I mean, yeah, there's a lot of money being set aside for infrastructure, for renewable projects, and there's also a lot of tax things that are being done in this area that people are following. But the landscape's shifting a little bit, and it's a little bit wait and see on a lot of this stuff, I think.
It's definitely wait and see at this point. And I think folks, you know, as with anything in Congress right now, you know, a skepticism of will it actually pass? But everybody's watching it, and everybody, you know, is thinking about it right now. That, like Todd said, there's a lot of money there. But then once that's passed, it takes years to actually get the regulations in place that would move that forward. You know, there's a whole administrative law process. And actually, that's the course, if you're really interested in energy or environmental law, you should take. You should take administrative law.
And Fed jur, because whether and how and when the courts can get involved in dealing with these issues that are in many cases in the first instance committed to regulators who have exclusive jurisdiction and have ways to keep themselves from being hauled into court, you want to know that stuff a lot.
I would throw in corporations minimum, maybe secured transactions, maybe bankruptcy, because clients never walk in with all their problems in one little package. So understanding how everything fits together is really important. And I think you've done a great job today of showing that to our students. So I think that is all the questions we have in the queue. I do want to thank both of you for being our first ones in this series. I very much want to encourage people to sign up for the rest of ours, and we will get that registration sheet figured out. And as I said, it was corrupted this morning, but we'll figure out a way and let people know how to sign up for upcoming ones. And we'll be delving into a lot more of these areas in the future. Thank you, Todd and Allison. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Donna.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
everybody.
much, Donna, for having us.